What if I told you that the greatest geopolitical entity on Earth has already completely lost its absolute grip on global authority, and you are currently living inside the lingering ghost of an empire that structurally collapsed while you were busy scrolling your feed? Welcome to Money's Hidden Past Rich People Lied. We fact-checked. Today, we are stripping down the unipolar moment and exposing exactly why the American empire has already fallen. When geopolitical analysts declare the end of the American empire, they absolutely do not mean the country is physically collapsing, or that the sovereign nation will suddenly vanish from the map. They mean the era of unquestioned global dominance is permanently over. To understand the magnitude of this structural shift, you must understand the architecture of the unipolar moment, that brief historical window immediately following the Cold War when Washington operated as the undisputed referee of the world. During that specific window, the American government dictated global trade. They enforced international borders and wrote the economic rules, operating a network of international institutions that served their interests and enjoying a level of structural supremacy unseen in human history. But that architecture is currently fracturing across multiple fault lines, driven primarily by a massive wave of economic decentralization, led by sovereign nations who recognized a critical vulnerability and decided to systematically bypass the traditional financial system. For decades, the global economy operated entirely on the fiat dollar, forcing every nation to conduct international trade using American currency, which granted Washington the absolute power to weaponize its banking system and cripple any dissenting nation by simply freezing their reserve accounts. This extraordinary financial leverage terrified the global South, prompting the formation of an alternative economic coalition known as BRICS, which originally brought together Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to actively build a parallel financial infrastructure outside Western control. This coalition recently expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Emirates, representing a massive geopolitical shift in the global energy market, and signaling that the nations controlling the physical commodities no longer trust the nation controlling the digital printing press. These sovereign states are aggressively executing a strategy of de-dollarization, settling their massive cross-border trade using their own local currencies and engineering alternative payment networks that bypass Western infrastructure, while silently accumulating thousands of tons of physical gold reserves. The BRICS coalition is explicitly designing resource-backed trade mechanisms to completely insulate their domestic economies from Western financial pressure, creating a robust parallel system that actively challenges the unipolar financial order and fundamentally alters the global balance of power for the next century. The transition away from the dollar will not happen overnight, but the structural foundation of the global reserve currency is cracking, exacerbated by a staggering $39 trillion national debt that mathematically guarantees the continuous debasement of the currency. Traditional analysts argue that American hegemony remains totally secure, pointing directly to the undisputed supremacy of the armed forces, and the massive defense budget approaching $900 billion that funds the most technologically advanced military apparatus ever constructed. They point to the massive nuclear aircraft carriers patrolling the oceans, and assume that overwhelming kinetic capability guarantees global compliance. But the conflicts of the 21st century proved a devastating reality. Military superiority no longer translates into geopolitical control. The protracted engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq exposed a fatal flaw, demonstrating that dropping trillion-dollar payloads on sovereign territory can successfully destroy a standing army and shatter a government, but it absolutely fails to build a nation or secure lasting political loyalty. These asymmetric conflicts cost the American taxpayer trillions of dollars and resulted in humiliating, chaotic withdrawals broadcast across the globe, proving to the international community that the global hegemon bleeds and shattering the psychological illusion of absolute American invincibility. The modern global chessboard operates on supply chains and digital networks, where raw physical force is increasingly irrelevant to economic victory. You cannot deploy a carrier strike group to fix a trade deficit, and you cannot bomb a rising superpower into technological submission as the absolute utility of traditional military force diminishes. We are witnessing the rapid rise of diplomatic independence, where ambitious middle powers actively ignore directives from Washington and ruthlessly pursue their own independent strategic interests. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and India operate as free agents, refusing to blindly align with the traditional Western diplomatic consensus, and actively negotiating massive infrastructure deals with China and Russia without ever asking the State Department for permission or approval when Saudi Arabia decides to price a fraction of its oil in foreign currencies, or when Turkey purchases advanced defense systems from Eastern rivals. They are sending a calculated and highly visible signal to the global markets that the traditional era of blind compliance to Western demands is terminated. This marks the definitive end of the unipolar command structure, transitioning the globe into a highly contested multipolar reality. where multiple competing centers of power possess roughly equal capabilities, and no single sovereign state can dictate the rules of engagement. The emerging multipolar landscape forces the legacy superpower to negotiate trading, diplomatic favors, and accepting compromises it previously ignored. Because when a middle power possesses multiple geopolitical options, the leverage permanently shifts away from the historical hegemon. But empires rarely fall solely because of external competition. Historical data proves they systematically rot from the inside out, collapsing under the crushing weight of their own internal contradictions long before the external perimeter is ever physically breached. The domestic architecture of the United States is experiencing severe fractures driven by extreme political polarization and widening wealth inequality that fundamentally destroys the social cohesion required for national unity and cripples the ability of the government to project strength abroad. The massive ideological divide tearing through the domestic population paralyzes the legislative process and creates wild swings in foreign policy, meaning international allies can no longer rely on long-term American commitments, because a new political administration might completely reverse the strategic agreements, a nation actively tearing itself apart over cultural grievances and spending its energy prosecuting internal political rivals cannot successfully manage a complex global empire because the foundational trust in domestic institutions has completely evaporated when the working class citizens of a declining superpower can no longer afford basic housing or groceries or medical care. They aggressively reject the concept of funding global hegemony, demanding the capital be redirected to their own crumbling infrastructure. This internal decay acts as a gravitational anchor on foreign policy, forcing political leaders to prioritize short-term domestic survival over the long-term strategic requirements of maintaining a global empire, accelerating the geopolitical retreat and surrendering the global stage. So if the structural reality of the American empire is currently ending, why do the vast majority of ordinary citizens fail to recognize it? Why does the daily routine feel exactly the same as it did a decade ago? And why does the illusion of absolute global control remain fully intact? The answer lies in a phenomenon known as the historical lag effect, because massive global empires do not vanish in a single afternoon. They decay slowly over the course of multiple successive generations, maintaining the superficial appearance of power long after the foundation crumbles. We can observe this exact dynamic by studying the British Empire, which functionally collapsed immediately following the Second World War, losing control over its massive overseas territories and colonies and surrendering its position as the undisputed global economic center. But the United Kingdom remained a wealthy and highly influential player, projecting a massive aura of historical prestige and cultural authority for decades after their absolute structural dominance had evaporated, because the momentum of an empire carries it forward through time. The American empire benefits from an unprecedented cultural dominance that actively masks the reality of its geopolitical decline, exporting its digital software and entertainment media to every corner of the earth and colonizing the psychological bandwidth of the global population. The algorithms designed in Silicon Valley dictate global digital communication, and the massive server farms located in the United States process global data, giving the American corporations unprecedented access to international commerce and projecting a massive shadow of digital sovereignty across the physical globe. Because American technology monopolies like Apple and Google dictate the digital realm, and Hollywood studios manufacture the dominant global entertainment narratives, the average citizen naturally assumes the underlying power structure is permanent, confusing brand recognition with actual geopolitical leverage. A citizen sitting in a cafe in Southeast Asia might use an American smartphone to consume American entertainment and purchase American fast food. But the physical infrastructure powering that digital transaction was likely financed and constructed by a rising Eastern superpower. This cultural ubiquity creates a powerful psychological blind spot, convincing the domestic population that their nation remains invincible simply because their corporate logos are recognized across the globe, whilst the actual mechanisms of global authority quietly slip away. This illusion is further reinforced by massive institutional inertia. The network of global governance organizations built after the Second World War, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, continue to operate out of their traditional Western headquarters. For decades, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank functioned as the primary financial enforcers of the Western consensus, providing critical bailout capital, strictly in exchange for structural compliance and ensuring developing nations remain securely tethered to the dollar system. These legacy institutions project an aura of established authority, creating a facade that the power structures of the 1990s are still in place, but their actual ability to dictate global economic policy is rapidly diminishing as alternative financial mechanisms slowly capture their market share. The rising multipolar powers no longer rely exclusively on the legacy institutions. They build their own regional development banks and credit facilities, bypassing the strict conditions imposed by the traditional Western lenders and accelerating the fragmentation of the global economic order. The United States will remain a massive and highly influential superpower, possessing an incredibly dynamic economy and a terrifying military arsenal. But the critical distinction is that it now operates as just one heavyweight, competing fiercely inside an increasingly crowded and contested geopolitical ring. It must now navigate a complex web of shifting alliances and regional powers rather than serving as the undisputed referee of the global system. Meaning, the rules of international commerce and diplomacy will no longer be written exclusively in English. You must recognize that the transition to a multipolar reality is not a future theoretical event waiting to happen. It is the current baseline operating condition of the global economy, and it dictates the flow of capital across the international borders. The investors who understand this fundamental geopolitical shift will adapt their portfolios to account for currency diversification and prepare for a global economy that relies less on the traditional reserve asset, while the citizens who remain blind to the transition will suffer the consequences. They will watch the purchasing power of their fiat currency slowly evaporate, wondering why the government cannot simply project power to fix the inflation, failing to understand that the leverage required to export their inflation was permanently lost when the Global South built an alternative financial bridge. The empire did not fall to a conquering barbarian army. It fell to the ruthless mathematics of compound debt and imperial overreach, spending trillions of dollars trying to forcefully shape the Middle East while their primary competitors quietly built the factories of the future. It fell because the elite class prioritized short-term financial extraction, outsourcing the industrial manufacturing base to secure higher profit margins, and destroying the foundational economic engine that built the empire, trading long-term structural sovereignty for a temporary spike in the stock market. The unipolar moment was a historical anomaly that could never be sustained, a brief distortion in the natural balance of global power, and the current geopolitical chaos is simply the international system violently returning to its natural state of multipolar competition. You must aggressively strip away the romanticized notions of global supremacy and analyze the international chessboard through the cold lens of structural leverage, recognizing that sovereign nations operate strictly on self-interest and loyalty to the traditional hegemon expires the moment a better deal arrives. Or the future of global commerce will be dictated by supply chain resilience and the ability to secure critical raw materials and technological components, rather than the ability to threaten a sovereign nation with naval blockades or impose unilateral financial sanctions through legacy banking networks. This is the unvarnished reality of the 21st century global economy, a fragmented and highly competitive landscape where power is decentralized and the traditional rules of the American century no longer apply, requiring a completely new framework for navigating geopolitical risk. If you blindly trust the legacy media narratives regarding global dominance, you will miscalculate the trajectory of international markets and position your capital exactly where the rising powers are attacking, serving as the exit liquidity for the geopolitical transition. You must monitor the expansion of the alternative payment rails, track the physical accumulation of sovereign gold reserves, and analyze the shifting diplomatic alignments of the middle powers, because these metrics reveal the true architecture of the new global order. The age of absolute unilateral control has officially concluded, and the era of aggressive multipolar competition has commenced. Meaning the standard assumptions governing the past 30 years of finance are now completely obsolete and structurally dangerous to rely upon. If this breakdown of the structural decline of the American empire and the dark math behind the transition to a multipolar world fired you up about taking absolute total control of your own permanent financial architecture, then do me a massive favor right now. Smash that like button to let the algorithm know this factual, historical conversation matters. Share this video with every friend and family member who needs to understand how the real financial world operates. Let us keep exposing the true mechanics of wealth and power. I will catch you in the next one, where we break down the next hidden chapter in the long history of money and corporate authority. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical, and remember that the most dangerous illusion in the modern global economies is believing that an empire can survive forever on the momentum of its past.